Hi, everybody, and welcome to our presentation today, Suicide Postvention and Contagion, Responding Effectively. I am in a moment going to introduce you to Scott Poland. We're delighted to have him. These are always fantastically informative sessions with a true expert in the field, and we're pleased to bring them to you. A couple of items of housekeeping that I want to take note of. One, the presentation will be recorded, and as an attendee, you will receive a copy of this recording. Second, a copy of the slides will also be sent to you. You are our audience in listen-only mode. That means we can't hear you. But if you want to ask questions, and we hope that you will, please use the dialog box at the right-hand side of your screen. You're welcome to submit your questions there, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. And do please connect with us online. That would be great. I'm going to let Scott introduce himself, but I want to just let you know a little bit about Kognito and the work that we do in the area of suicide prevention. We are a developer of online and mobile simulations, and with a focus on enabling positive behavior change through the power of conversations. We know that conversations can save lives, and we hope that we can teach as many people as possible to have those conversations effectively, especially when it comes to kids. Many of our simulations are listed in the National Registry of Evidence-Based Programs and Practices and the SPRC Best Practices Registry, and are available at no cost in many states across the country. Meanwhile, this is a really effective and new tool for a lot of people, but nearly 200,000 educators have already been trained using our tool. And before I introduce Scott, I do want to, and I know he's going to talk a lot about suicide prevention being postvention being prevention. As a producer of suicide prevention programs, it's always very sobering to find that districts and states and schools adopt our programs after a suicide, and we hope more of them and more of you will adopt them prior to a suicide in your community. And with that, I will turn it over to Scott. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Jennifer, and it's indeed my pleasure today to have a chance to talk about such an important issue. And you know, Schneidman, many years ago, coined the term postvention, a series of helpful acts after a dire event. You know, nobody is talking about postvention after a car accident or postvention after we lose student to cancer, for example. It really has come to mean after a suicide. And, you know, I first responded to a suicide in the Texas schools in 1981, and I am still working on this very same issue and agree so much with many of the points that you have made. And I'm not sure there could be anything really more scary for a school than having a student die by suicide. And today, I'm going to argue that that ripple effect in the schools, the neighborhood, the entire community is greater than ever before. And if everybody listening could just imagine, you take a rock and you throw it into a pond, and the ripple effect is going to be quite extensive. And I think everybody would immediately realize why the ripple effect is greater than ever before. It really has to do with social media. And I do believe the wisest decisions in education are made by a team of people. And to be quite honest, administrators typically have not received much training in suicide prevention, intervention, or postvention. And I heartily recommend that everyone listening simply Google "after a suicide, a toolkit for schools." It came out in May of 2011. It's going to answer virtually any question you could possibly have. It's going to even have sample letters that you can use in some very delicate and very tragic situations. I'm pleased to tell you I did have a small role in helping to develop that toolkit. And I'm also constantly amazed at how many personnel that work in schools have never heard of the toolkit. I am involved now in working on some revisions to the toolkit. Primarily, what will be strengthened will be the section on social media, more information about contagion and clusters. And also, right in the beginning, I want to say that the research has basically said this about schools and postvention. Our efforts are too short in duration. They focus on too few students. We've had studies of suicide clusters, and I've been involved in responding to a number of suicide clusters. There's often a lot of academic pressure on students. Sometimes it's from the school. Sometimes it's from the school and the parents. There's often a lack of awareness of mental health needs of students. And it is my hope that, of course, as a result of today, there'll be increased prevention efforts, less need for postvention, but hopefully there will be a well-planned postvention that will go a long ways towards helping all of the students with their shock, their grief, their confusion, and yes, sometimes even their guilt. So let's move through a couple of slides here if we can. And I already mentioned the term clusters. In just a moment, we're going to talk about the fact that there are two types of clusters, mass and point clusters. We don't know exactly why these occur, but we do believe that this contagion is part of the process. And the one thing I want to say really clearly right in the beginning, the literature never said do nothing after a student death by suicide. Yes, there has always been the thought, don't go overboard with glorification and glamorization, but it never said don't talk about it. It always said put the focus on the living. How do we help them with their complex array of emotions? How do we make sure that everybody knows warning signs, everybody knows crisis hotline numbers, and everybody is aware of the need to get adult help when somebody is suicidal. So mass clusters are really media related. When we have a celebrity that might die, obviously there was a lot of concern after the suicide of Robin Williams. I can tell you that calls went up to crisis hotlines, but the actual suicide rate in America did not go up because of his tragic death. And we could go all the way back to a book that was written in Germany several hundred years ago about the sorrows of young Werther that resulted in increases in suicide throughout basically Western Europe. But the research is really saying that mass clusters, we don't have a lot of evidence that they are really occurring. What everybody is concerned about and what is occurring are what are called point clusters, and I'll get to those in just a moment. But for a long time, we've pretty much pointed the finger at the media. They're inappropriate, they're sensationalized coverage of the suicide of a young person, and certainly it could contribute, but I'm really glad to tell you that more and more media outlets are following these guidelines. But perhaps the simplest way I can make a point is with a what not to do example. Springfield, Missouri, front page, picture of a beautiful girl, headline, popular Ozark student falls to dark and lonely thoughts. It described how she got her best dress cleaned, picked it up at the cleaners. It was black, of course. She put it on. She drove to the Holodome. She ordered a Coke, dropped her cyanide tablet in the Coke, fell dead to the floor, and the final sentence in the article was, she was just too sensitive for this tough world. That was pretty much everything wrong in one story. And what should the media coverage be about? Crisis hotlines, warning signs, stories about young people who came forward and got help for their friends, stories about suicides being prevented. That's what I wish the media would cover. So, point clusters. This is what we have the most research supporting. And I want to be honest in telling you that in my experience, We actually have these point clusters happening in many locations around the country. Schools and communities are slow to recognize it. Once you recognize it, basically your parents and your community is going to be, what is wrong with our school? What is wrong in our community? And I noted in the news that in Pennsylvania, 1,400 parents signed a petition basically demanding to know what the school was going to do about suicide prevention. And obviously it's a complex issue. It's going to take a partnership between schools, community leaders, mental health, law enforcement, agencies, state and local resources. But I do believe strongly schools have a role to play, and they can do a lot more than they're currently doing to prevent youth suicides. So we've got to be the most concerned about suicide contagion with our adolescent population. I doubt if anybody listening is aware of suicide cluster or contagion in a retirement center. It seems to be something that primarily happens for adolescents in our country. And schools have a tendency, and please know everything that I'm saying to you is based on personally working in schools full-time for 26 years. And although I'm at a university now, I am in contact with school personnel almost on a daily basis about issues that have to do with the problem of youth suicide. But a typical school response is to think this only affects our school. But wait a minute, she played on a travel soccer team. There were teammates from 8 other high schools. And yes, this is going to have a profound effect throughout the community. And as I said earlier, those connections and vulnerable youth actually find each other in greater numbers than ever before in our country. And I do believe that schools are the logical place to intervene with a very well-planned scenario and following the best practices guidelines, that after suicide toolkit from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, from the Suicide Prevention Resource Center. That is the guide that schools need to use with these primary goals: assisting survivors in the grief process, identifying and getting support for other students. A counselor might say something to me like this: well, an 11th grader died by suicide yesterday. I'm actually the 9th grade counselor. I've been working with 8 students that have already made suicide attempts this year. Should I check with all of them today? And the answer to that is, of course, yes. It's not that you even have to have known the suicide victim. You just know what they did. You might think of the method they used. You might think you know something about the problems they had in their life. You might view your problems, your life as parallel, even though you believe you have even more significant issues. I remember one young woman after a suicide she said the whole school was buzzing about what Amy did. Amy made a statement that will never be forgotten in this high school. And of course, soon I found out that the young woman I'm working with is also suicidal, but I said, did you know Lily? Oh, you didn't know Lily? She went to this school last year. Lily died by suicide. Nobody's talking about Lily. Life is going to go on, and we need to figure out how we can get you the help that you need. Most recently, in a private school, the students basically said the administration has erased her. It's like we're never supposed to talk about her again. They're going through the yearbook right now and trying to make sure there are not any pictures of her in the yearbook. Well, I think everybody listening would realize that we cannot erase their friends. They need to have multiple opportunities to talk about what it's like to lose a classmate and a friend to suicide. So very important that we have these ongoing prevention efforts. I'm going to talk to you very briefly about perhaps the only lawsuit of its kind. Yes, I was involved. I was on the side of the plaintiff. against the Shawnee Mission schools. They're a suburb of Kansas City. So what was the case all about? Sophomore brother died by suicide. Unfortunately, the school system did absolutely nothing. They didn't follow the after suicide toolkit for schools recommendations. They didn't reach out to his family, most notably to his older brother who attended the same high school. They were even quoted as saying, "What's this have to do with us?" He hung himself at the Shawnee Mission Park. We do reading, writing, and arithmetic. As you might imagine, the older brother at the same high school had a lot of difficulty in the aftermath of his younger brother's suicide. He kept going to the Shawnee Mission Park. He kept asking the park employees, which street did my brother use to die? Of course, they'd never tell him. But unfortunately, not too long after the death of his brother, he also hung himself. And the mom, Mrs. Maris, do you know what she wanted? She wanted what I believe everybody listening today should do. She just wanted increased suicide prevention efforts. She wanted a plan. She wanted them to use Postvention, the toolkit, if it ever happened again. She wanted them to talk about suicide prevention with the faculty, to make sure key personnel like psychologists, social workers, nurses, and counselors were well trained in suicide assessment. She wanted them to post information on the district website about the problem of youth suicide, warning signs, and most importantly, where to go for help. And I'm going to ask you, do you think the things I just went over would have cost a lot of money? Oh, they might have brought in a speaker, but for the most part, it's more of a philosophical issue. So they fought her in court over a several-year period. You can imagine what that might have cost the district. Ultimately, they settled in a sealed mediation. But please know, the literature never said do nothing, which is exactly what they did in Shawnee Mission, Kansas. So here's a little bit of information about Contagion. You see some data there. Estimates, 1 to 5% of all youth suicides are really the result of Contagion. My simple thought is that is an extreme underestimate, but a very difficult question to research. The Center for Disease Control has gone to places where I've been recently, like Fairfax County, Virginia, where they had a cluster, like Palo Alto, California, where they actually experienced their second cluster in 4 years. So they have studied it, really trying to figure out what it is. And key points are pressure on students, pressure they put on themselves, pressure that comes from the school, pressure that comes from parents. And then there's other key issues that have been found also in really what is referred to sometimes as autopsy studies, but the lack of recognition of the problem. Parents being reluctant to get needed mental health assistance for their child. Parents have difficulty separating what's typical teenage moodiness, irritability. I mean, aren't all teenagers like that at some point? Well, the issues are, is this pervasive? Is this affecting all aspects of their life? Are they dropping out of pleasureful activities that previously relieved a lot of stress for them? Is it persistent? Meaning, has this gone on for 2 or 3 weeks or more? If so, don't hesitate. Get mental health treatment for your child. And there you see some of the autopsy study research from the American Association of Suicidology, issues that have to do with gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, questioning youth, and issues that have to do with substance abuse. And the Canadian studies have really emphasized our postvention efforts are too short in duration, focus on too few students. And with one of the places where I'm currently consulting, they had several suicides of students in the month of May. Well, they got to have a plan for over the summer. They have counselors that work into June. They can get extra resources. They can work hard to link with the community. They can't just go, oh, thank God school's out. It's not our responsibility anymore. They really need to be working for continual support over the summer for all those students that are affected. So, pretty well covered these points in terms of vulnerable youth, some of the common risk factors. Key points, and I cannot overemphasize this. Basically, when a young person dies by suicide, we need to all think it was untreated or it was undertreated mental illness, and we have to advocate for more services. We also have to recognize, we go all the way back to the theory of Emil Durkheim, connections. When some student dies by suicide, our school, our community, we have failed to have them connected and have them receiving the support that they need. And worldwide, if we were look at what the World Health Organization says, education for everybody. I'm a big fan of the legislation that mandates training for all school staff every year. I support legislation like Jamie's Law in West Virginia, which means we have to figure out how can we provide a dialogue and suicide prevention information for our students. And perhaps the greatest myth that I encounter all the time is somebody saying, oh, we can't ask directly about it. We just might plant the idea in their head. Nothing could be further from the truth. You're not going to be able to find me any adolescents in this country that don't know somebody that at least talked about suicide. It's also very important that we get physicians involved in suicide prevention. More about that later. But here's a call that I got from a principal. Was basically 4 of their students had died by suicide in a short period of time. They're basically saying, why can't they just get up every morning and be so happy to be here? And basically, I wish it was that simple. But the reality is we have to increase our efforts. Postvention really takes the entire community, no single agency or entity, everybody working together. And what would everybody be? Local physicians that would be screening every adolescent that comes in the office for any reason, screening them for thoughts of depression and suicide. Law enforcement on board, survivor groups, parents, mental health, school and community leaders, everybody working together to prevent youth suicides. So another time I got a call from a different principal who was like, the parents of the suicide victim, they want a scholarship in their memory. And he basically faxed me a copy of the media guidelines. But he clearly had not read After a Suicide, a Toolkit for Schools. And I cannot overemphasize this. Strive to treat all the deaths the same. What did you do for the kid who was killed crossing the street? What did you do for the kid who died of leukemia? Treat all the deaths the same. And when I ask, do you have scholarships in memory of kids who died from other causes? Well, yes. Well, then you need to do it for the suicide victim as well. And then I got down to what he was really the most concerned about. He's going to have to hand Mrs. Jones the microphone, and she's going to tell us all a long, agonizing story. And my thought was, don't hand her a microphone. Just recognize her and her husband and say thank you for this donation to the scholarship fund in memory of your child. And I was reviewing a school district policy and plan just yesterday, and it said, do not put the flag at half-mast. So I immediately wrote back, well, have you done that for other deaths? Then you need to do it for the suicide victim. Schools have spent a lot of time and energy arguing with students, when in reality, we should just acknowledge they're having a lot of emotions. Let's be compassionate. Let's be creative. Hopefully, yes, let's guide them to what are called living memorials, where we're promoting suicide prevention. We're raising money so we have more counseling assistance available. But let's not argue with them and tell them, no, we can't do something we've already done before. There's a quote from Madeleine Gould at Columbia. and it basically underscores what I said a few minutes earlier about untreated, undertreated mental illness. We've got to use the terminology in the mental health field, pathways to care. And by the way, in our schools, not enough to just refer them to any counselor, therapist, or psychologist. We need to refer them to those that we know are well trained in suicide assessment and management. Let me quote a parent for you in Omaha, Nebraska. I did exactly what the school said. I took my kid to see the psychologist. He told me my kid was just a typical teenager. 3 weeks later, my kid was dead. So very important that we refer to people that are very skilled in this. And these are the questions that the students have asked me countless times in classrooms. And let me be really clear about something. No assemblies after a suicide. We should work with students in a classroom. I don't even want 100 kids to gather in the library. I want to do it in the classroom with the desks in a circle, and smaller numbers will be seen in the counseling office. Why did he do it? The answers have died with him. We're going to never know exactly why he did what he did. I'm here to help you. You lost a friend. You lost a classmate. What method did he use? Frankly, I find it the simplest to just say it. He hung himself. He shot himself. I'm not going to dwell on details. I'm going to continually put the focus, how can I help you? How can we make sure everybody gets the help that they need? Why didn't God stop them? Now, there's a tough one. I don't claim to be a religious expert, but here is something a number of wise members of the clergy have said that I believe is the right approach. You're wondering why God didn't stop them. God couldn't stop them. God has embraced them, yes. They're in whatever afterlife you believe in. But God's actually sad that she didn't stay on this earth over her natural lifetime. Why do I like that so much? Embraced, yes. Not chosen at the age of 12 to die by suicide. I once attended a funeral where there were nearly 1,000 students in attendance. Unfortunately, it was during the school day. I'm always arguing for the funeral to be after school so that the parents can accompany their children. And I'm looking around and realizing there are very few parents here. And then the member of the clergy, the exact words were, her burdens were so great. Because her burdens were so great, she had to come to God. If your burdens ever become so great, you too must come to God. As a psychologist, I'm wanting to scream. Tell them through service. Tell them through worship. Tell them through Bible study. Don't leave it. Come to God the way she did. And by the way, I always stress the young person who died by suicide, they traveled a very long road. There's no one thing. There's no one person. No specific thing or person is to blame. And frankly, the answers have died with them. And yes, it is okay to be angry at the suicide victim. So there's a report that came out in 2009, largely ignored by our physicians. So if you work in a community where you know a youth suicide occurred, what do we need every physician in your community to be doing? No matter what the reason was that brought the adolescent into their office, they need to fill out one of those short questionnaires about thoughts of depression and suicide. It needs to be scored before the kid walks out of the office. That's imperative in the aftermath of a youth suicide. And of course, what would I really hope? Everybody listening has a suicide prevention task force. That task force is linked with community partners. Many of these points I've already made about training everybody what to look for, what to do. Information on the district website. Parent notification when a student is believed to be suicidal is absolutely essential. There's only one exception. You believe the child is being abused. Now you are calling protective services. Utilize those best practices guidelines after a suicide toolkit for schools. Promise me you're going to Google that and download it after this webinar. The next version probably will not be out for another year. They're not going to change the basic theme, which is strive to treat all the deaths the same. And that also says it is problematic to try to prohibit any memorialization at school. It's okay to do a few things at school. Do we want to dedicate the year to them or the spring dance? No. But having some things written, lighting a few candles, but to focus always on, as a society, how can we do better? How can we all know what to look for and what to do so this does not keep happening? A question I'm always asked, and I wish I could tell you that we had an absolutely definitive response to this. This is what the Center for Disease Control has said. Who is of highest risk after a suicide has occurred? Well, did somebody back out of the suicide pact? That's incredibly rare, but sometimes there are pacts. The next one would be, did somebody's mistreatment contribute? An example from a Houston high school. It was the perfect party. Why was it the perfect party? No adults were there whatsoever. Lots of drinking, lots of teenagers. The young woman had been carrying Dad's gun around for a week. She carried it in and out of our schools. He never missed it. The friends knew the gun was in her purse. They never reported it. She's drinking heavily. Her boyfriend breaks up with her in a very messy scene. She's already been known to be suicidal. She's being treated for depression. Boyfriend leaves with new girlfriend. And I'm really horrified to tell you that 4 kids on Monday morning admitted they told her Saturday night, that was the night she was supposed to die. We told her where to put the gun, pull the trigger, it'll be quick. They're going to remember that last interaction with her for the rest of their lives. Others would have never encouraged her to die by suicide, but they're now realizing that note she wrote, when she gave me her grandma's necklace, the one she inherited, her most treasured possession from her grandma, I should have realized something. So now we're going to get down to something that I said earlier about it, the ripple in the pond. You don't even have to have known her. Maybe you could have picked her out of a lineup. Maybe you knew where her locker was. Maybe you had one class with her 2 years ago. You just know what she did. And because you have previously been suicidal, that lowers inhibitions and barriers to know somebody has actually done this. So what does the Center for Disease Control say? I've made these points earlier, but I think it's really important that you see them. Convene a planning committee that involves a lot of people. A public response that minimizes sensationalism, avoids glorification, but also identifies for everybody sources of help, counseling for friends of the victim and those previously known to be suicidal. There are all of the community resources. I rattled off some of those earlier. I don't think I mentioned the clergy. They do have a very important role. I don't think I mentioned crisis hotline personnel and trying to work with your media. One of the places where I responded last year, pretty frustrating, but the nearest major paper never seemed to focus on all of the very positive, preventative things that were being done by the Fairfax County schools. They just kept focusing on the problem and the number of deaths, when really the story should have been Fairfax County schools bringing in experts. Fairfax County schools are going to participate in the study with the Center for Disease Control. Fairfax County schools making mental health and suicide prevention a top priority for the school district. That's what the stories need to be about. So, moving on, So there are the main points that are in that toolkit. It's important that you see them. I still encounter people who somehow got the idea, no, we could never have a bench. Not too long ago, I went to a school and they were apologizing because they planted a tree. They had a plaque, and I mean, well, let's go take a look at, show me where the tree and the plaque are. Well, as we walked way behind the school to the girls' practice soccer field, there was a tree and a plaque. It was not the first thing you saw when you tried to walk in the front door of the school. And I'm saying, that's okay. Students have a need to do something. What if they arrive the next day with T-shirts that have the picture of Princess Leia, who died by suicide the day before? Basically, what am I going to say? Go with it. Let them wear their T-shirts today and talk with them of how can we guide them to living memorials, raising awareness of suicide prevention, and yes, we do need you to wear something tomorrow besides the T-shirt in memory of your close friend. We understand that you're wanting to honor them today. Monitoring the social networking sites. So you might be thinking, well, how in the world can we do that? It's so complicated. How do we even keep up? Well, the bottom line is after suicide, you meet with some responsible students, and there's some great students out there, and you simply say, we have to have some idea about what's going on. Please keep us posted on what kind of things are being said online. And if students have some kind of memorial away from campus, we either need to attend or we need to make sure through parents and other students we have some idea about what the students are experiencing. I remember sitting and looking with the school counselors at a casket. The funeral was for yet another suicide victim, and it was the type of casket that had the exterior where kids could write their goodbye messages to their friend. We obviously are reading every single message, trying to get an idea of how students are responding to this. We are reading the blogs in the newspaper, trying to keep up with how impactful is this going to be. So sometimes we do not know. We have the rumors that it was a suicide. One time I'm in the principal's office. There were about a dozen people gathered there, and the principal said we got the call that it was a suicide. It was carbon monoxide poisoning in the garage. But about half the people in the room could have been an accident. She was just listening to the radio at 3 o'clock in the morning and was overcome. The other half were saying, I don't think so. So I requested of the principal, let's go visit the family. Let's go find out. So now we drive to the home, we meet the family, we find out in short order that yes, it was a suicide. We explain persuasively to the parents, how are we going to be able to help your child's friends the best? How can we prevent further suicides? By being able to simply acknowledge it was a death by suicide. We will never try to explain why. In fact, we will say the answers have died with your daughter, but we do need to focus on warning signs and future suicide prevention efforts in our school and community. And who did I meet immediately? Surviving sibling, 1 year younger, same high school. Can you see what tough duty that would be for her? So if you're not sure, get in your car, go see the family, express condolences. Now we're going to get to perhaps the stickiest issue here. What if you want to treat it as a suicide and they're telling you absolutely not? We do not give you permission to do that. Well, here's what I said to a school district yesterday. Go back and meet with your crisis team. Review that section of the After Suicide Toolkit. Look at the sample letter they provide for you that says something like, the parents have asked that the cause of death of their child not be acknowledged. We do want to honor their wishes, but we believe it's very important that we do let you know that suicide is the second leading cause of death for teenagers in our country. And here are the things that we need to all be doing to try to prevent any suicides. And I remember one school board member telling me, oh, we could not possibly use that letter. And I was basically saying, well, but what I believe is we have to realize that postvention, it's really an opportunity for prevention of further deaths. So please review those letters and the toolkit. And yes, I have had the experience of talking with the family and saying, have you thought about when you might schedule the funeral? Because if we do it after school or in the evening, parents will hopefully be there with their children. I've also had the experience of talking with the member of the clergy who will conduct the service and trying to help them promote prevention and not give the message that he or she was chosen at this time. Parent meetings are really important, and I've learned a lot about parent meetings over the years. The last time in my old district, we'd had several suicides. We had nearly 100,000 students. Information about suicide prevention is everybody's responsibility. Scott Poland will be talking Wednesday night at 7 p.m. in the middle school auditorium. Please attend. Theoretically, we could have had a very large crowd. We actually had 5. One guy was my next door neighbor. He rode with me. Really feel like I can't count him. So what have I learned? I titled the presentation for parents quite differently today. Building Success and Resiliency for Your Child. Safeguarding Students in a Challenging World. Courageous Conversations Between Schools and Parents. Are they going to get suicide prevention information? Absolutely. They're going to get good parenting information. They're going to get information about the dangers of cars and adolescence and drinking. They're going to get information about the importance of being involved in your child's life. So when we promote it as simply suicide prevention, by the way, sometimes we will have a large crowd if it's the day after a suicide, and they want you to tell them, here are all the things that were going wrong in this kid's life. Here were all the things the family didn't do right. Obviously, we wouldn't know, and even if we did have some ideas, we could never talk about those things. So they're actually hoping they can go, oh, we don't do any of those things, so we can relax. Unfortunately, parents all across the country need to be very concerned about thoughts of depression and thoughts of suicide for their child, and schools do need to provide them information about what to do and where to go to get help. So these are pretty straightforward. I talked about most of these. Prohibiting all memorials is problematic. Okay. Meet with students, be creative, guide them to suicide prevention efforts. In our larger cities, if a high school kid is 18 years old, they can be trained. They can be answering the phone at the teen crisis line. It pretty much goes without saying that I would be opposed to holding a suicide victim's funeral on school grounds. I can give you examples where that was done, where it was done during the middle of the school day, where every student felt like they had to go to the funeral in the high school gym. But I really like to see these ceremonies move to places in the community. There we go with a number of other specific points, and perhaps I can summarize all of these with this simple question. What have you previously done when you have lost a student, where they have died or they've been killed, regardless of the reason? And whatever you have previously done, that is what you need to do from this point on. Hopefully, there's a school out there that has not lost a student. They haven't died for any reason. Well, if that's the case, write your policy now. Stick to it. It shouldn't matter cause of death. It shouldn't matter how well known, how popular they are. how influential their parents are. Same thing for every student. And I cannot overemphasize untreated, undertreated mental illness, and the media needs to focus on how do we all get help. The sample letter I mentioned just a moment ago, and I'm going to bring my comments to a close in just a moment, but please review that toolkit. There is the latest book. It's my 5th one. I'm really proud to tell you that my first book on suicide in the schools was 1989, and I'm the co-author of a book 26 years later. Where I work, we had a federal grant. We created a lot of training materials. If you visit the website for the Suicide and Violence Prevention Office at Nova Southeastern University, and you click on the Postvention video, there I am with one of my colleagues and a school principal talking about what to do in the tragic aftermath of a student suicide. There are resources that I have mentioned today, and I'm going to turn it back to Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Scott. I'm sure everybody out there is furiously taking notes. I just want to answer the many questions of, are we sending out the slides and is there a recording? The answer to that is yes. And then I want to move quickly to some questions that have come in. Some of them are just really repeating things that you've said or re-emphasizing them. But a couple of corner cases came in that I think will be interesting to people. So let's get to it right away. Now, the name of the toolkit that you were referencing is, and please repeat it.
Sure. After a suicide, a toolkit for schools. It was put out by the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, the Suicide Prevention Resource Center. They'll find it easily on Google with one click.
Right.
It's about 45 pages. I believe all schools need to download and have a copy, and they do need to share it with the building principal.
Yeah. Okay. So, and with regard to that, one other follow-up question is, how adaptable is that toolkit for other settings? For example, cyber schools, alternative schools, juvenile justice settings, or other kinds of settings that address adolescents?
I believe it is very adaptable. You know, the basic information is pretty much the same for everyone. And as I said earlier, no assemblies, no gathering of large numbers of students, classrooms and smaller, a chance to talk about not why they did what they did, how can we help you with your thoughts and feelings. There's no right or wrong way to feel today. How can we all recognize the scope of this problem in our society, what to look for and what to do in the future?
Okay, great. I'm going to ask you to make your responses as short as possible so I can get to as many questions as possible. I think most of us could spend like the rest of the afternoon on this. This is so important. What grade can I start teaching students about suicide? What grade level?
Great question. You know, all of our best practices programs really are secondary. One promising program is the Good Behavior Game, which is elementary. I believe we've got to start having conversations in 4th or 5th grade about what to do in certain situations. And I was involved in one case, tragically, where the 5th grade boy wrote a suicide note, handed it to his classmate. Unfortunately, she had no idea what to do. So we've got to get better programs in place as early as 4th and 5th grade.
Yeah. Okay. And that's what we heard a lot here at Kognito too, which is why we created a version of our at-risk training for elementary schools. There's a great need out there among the younger grades. How long should you wait to do suicide prevention training after, so not all postvention activities, but just the training aspect after a death in a school?
Great question, because sometimes I think schools they'll like postpone, and I'm going to argue we need it more than ever before. So I pretty much believe almost immediately we need to start talking about prevention. And perhaps one thing that will help people feel better is sometimes I will say we are not able to prevent every youth suicide. We could not prevent this one, tragically, but we can prevent the vast majority, and that's why we're focusing on prevention today. So I'm not trying to make anybody feel guilty, but I'm also realizing this is an opportunity. And as you well know, sadly, often in our schools it takes multiple suicides for schools to get on board doing what Kognito knows they need to be doing today.
Right. And that leads into a double question about training resources and tools. One is with regard to counselors, what suicide risk assessment would you recommend? And second, with regard to teachers, what training, suicide prevention training resources would you recommend?
Great question. And one of the things that I've been working on for the state of Texas is writing the Suicide Safer School Plan for Texas. It's available at texassuicideprevention.org. Teachers need an hour minimum, and it needs to go over warning signs, what to look for, referral procedures, don't keep a secret. Counselors, in my opinion, need several hours of training, and I am specifically, they need to be trained on the importance of direct questioning about suicidal thoughts today, previous attempt ever, do you have a plan today? And I have become a big fan of the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale.
Okay. And what about training for teachers, which is a different type of training, right?
Yes, that would be what I said in the beginning, about an hour about warning signs, what to look for, don't keep a secret, scope of the problem, who do we refer to in our schools, the importance of literally walking a student to the counseling office as opposed to waiting for them to get there on their own. So Kognito has excellent programs in terms of increasing training for really all school staff.
Right, and I would add, in addition to ours, the best practice, the Suicide Prevention Resource Center's best practices registry, and the National Registry of Evidence-Based Programs and Practices are great places to look for these resources. And one of our audience members wants to volunteer Safe Talk and Assist, which are also wonderful tools if you're doing face-to-face training. Another question, where am I? What can you say about support for staff who may be grieving? We didn't talk a lot about that, but staff are obviously affected by a suicide in the school.
Absolutely. Well, the wise administrator would provide support for his staff immediately and in a group format, but individual teachers might need to be seen by the school counselor, school psychologist initially. They might need to get help through the employee assistance program. There may be a teacher who had their own life touched by a suicide. Now it's happened to one of their students. And I really believe that, the best practices in schools start with well-informed, knowledgeable administrators that basically understand the scope of this problem, know the resources, listen to their counselors and school psychologists who are bringing in resources and making recommendations about what to do to help everybody, staff and students.
Scott, can you address, I got a couple questions here about cultural specificity and language. What about schools that have a very diverse population with a lot of parents, for example, from other cultures and other languages?
Okay, very challenging, because we well know that in particular Native Americans have very high suicide rates, and having responded to tragedies on reservations, you've got to get the tribal leaders involved. We also have people from so many parts of the world and so many cultures, and to be honest, not all of those cultures are that embracing of my recommendation about you need to get mental health treatment for your child outside of school. So we have language barriers, and people on school crisis teams need to know, the dominant language of the families. We need to know as much as possible about the culture. We might have to reach out and bring somebody in from another part of our school district that would be, more easily able to develop rapport with a particular family. But absolutely, these cultural issues are huge. We could have an entire webinar on that issue.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe we should have another webinar on that issue. A lot of a question about the duration. So we talked a lot about what happens immediately in the aftermath and when training efforts might begin. But how long should an administrator or planners think about postvention activities as they're planning in their either in preparation or after a death?
Great question. Here's what happens after a suicide occurs. Schools basically increase their awareness efforts. More and more kids are referred to the counseling office. They're identified as having suicidal thoughts. Many referrals are made to the community, and this is actually a good thing. But then we have some students that are going to be hospitalized. We got to have a reentry program when they return. At a minimum, when we have a student that's known to be suicidal and they've been referred out in the community, hopefully we get a release of information so we can exchange information with the community provider. But I believe that at school we need to have a weekly face-to-face follow-up. And then schools really struggle with, if I know a kid's suicidal and I'm the counselor, can I tell anybody else? My belief is clarification of FERPA, emergency situation, tell everybody who needs to know. And we're not going to try to explain why the kid is suicidal. We're just going to simply let teachers know depression and suicidal thought have been a problem. Please be alert for warning signs. If you see them in their statements, in their writing, you see dramatic changes, get that student back to me immediately. So I'll stand by the Canadian study that too short in duration, postvention, focusing on too few students. They actually said having a classmate die by suicide may affect you for as long as 6 years. Now, thankfully, most students are going to be okay, but I would argue that approximately 10 to 20% are going to have long-term issues. They're going to know the birthday their classmate would have had. They're going to know the anniversary of their death. We don't need to be making an announcement, but we need to be reaching out to those that we know were the closest to the suicide victim, literally for months. Then
I think that's going to be where we close it. I have 1,000 more questions that I could ask you. There does seem, the whole notion of cultural and religious specificity seems really a hot topic, so maybe we can do a follow-up on that later in the summer or early in the fall. And we'll take a quick look after this at other questions that came in that we weren't able to address. But Scott, we're at the 2 o'clock mark. Everybody's got to go back to whatever they were doing. And first, thank everybody on the call for all the work you do with young people in distress every single day. And Scott, thank you again for taking the time out to do this very, very important session for our audience.
My pleasure.